Welcome to Secular Stories. I'm your host, Dr. David Orenstein. Our guest today is Sue Cox. My special guest today is founding member of Survivor's Voice Europe. She's an advocate for healing across several important areas affecting our secular world. She is a respected author, and she is an activist in supporting victims of clergy sexual and other abuse. She is an advocate for those serving time in prison and helping them deal with returning to non-prison life. And she's also a healer related to her work as a therapist, dealing with the vagaries of substance abuse. Sue is a dear friend of mine and my family. We have known each other for almost a decade, and she serves not only as my friend, but in many cases, my muse, and in several cases, my conscience. So welcome, Sue.
Thank you so much. What a welcome, and that's a lot to live up to, David. The main thing is that, it's nice for people to know that we're friends, and that's so important, isn't it? And wonderful. So I'm very pleased to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you. So before we sort of jump in, could you talk to us a little bit about your childhood and your family's relation to the church?
Yes. I think you can't talk about anything that comes later in life when if you don't touch on things that actually set it in motion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I kind of reflected on all of this over the last few years, largely because of writing. So thinking about it is part of writing it down. I was adopted to start with. Actually, I think they bought me. I don't quite know how much they paid for me, but I think money changed hands. I was adopted into a fiercely Catholic family. I'm not talking about your ordinary everyday Catholic. I'm talking about the kind of family where everything but breathing was sinful. Practically everything you did, was sinful. So you were watched all the time. I think I probably already had abandonment issues because I think in those days, adoption wasn't handled well. And so it was a sort of, do you want a baby? Here's a baby. That was the sort of thing. And this obsessive religion was a household full of fear. So it revolved around the church, sort of praying and rosaries and going to mass and confession, which is a bête noire of mine. It's a breeding ground for grooming. So it was very fear oriented.
Mm-hmm.
When I was about 5, I was asked to kneel with a cousin, with my family, to pray for a cousin of mine to die because he was about to embark upon marriage to a divorcee. And in those days, the family thought it was outrageous and decided, the parish priest said to his mother, that he'd be better off dead than living in sin. So we should all pray for him to have a happy death. Now, I was kneeling. You can imagine your lovely little girl kneeling to pray for somebody to die. And I was terrified. And I thought that every time I put a foot wrong, somebody somewhere was praying for me to die. So I grew up with this fight or flight, hypervigilance all the time, terrified of putting a foot wrong. And, knowing that somebody somewhere was praying for me to die. It was a really sort of toxic environment. Priests were idolized. They were deified. They could do no wrong. They were considered to be next to God. And we lived at the coast in a tiny little seaside town on the east coast of England. And we didn't have a priest's house. So this priest was billeted in a family, and that happened to be our family. So he came to live with us. And there was my adopted mother and father and 2 spinster sisters who doted on this priest. It was a really bizarre household.
It seems like a master-slave almost experience.
Oh, it was, absolutely. And he was do you know, they would say that he had sacred hands. So he had to have brand new towels every day that none of us could use because they were going to touch his sacred hands. So it was as you say, a slave master, toxic, power imbalanced setup. Really sort of obsessive, really, and quite toxic.
Mhm.
And I'm asthmatic, and I was quite poorly as a child, and pain or illness was always considered something that you should be grateful for. The idea was that you should offer it up in atonement for your terrible sins, not only the ones you've done, but also the ones that you're liable to do. So if I was gasping for breath, they would say, offer it up. I
Wow.
fell off a swing, I broke my ankle, offer it up. So there was sympathy was a dirty word, and you should offer it up. So fear and uh, sort of unworthiness was
Mhm.
always the carrying cry. The whole point of being a human being was being completely unworthy of everything. So,
And subservient to
oh,
God and those who spoke for God. It's almost a martyr's life, if you will. It's very reminiscent of, let's say, Mother Teresa, who, Hitchens talked about extensively. To the world, she's the savior, but in reality, she thought
toxic.
suffering was great. It brought you closer to Christ if you
That's
suffered.
exactly right. It's a very clever way of keeping people subjugated. I mean, that narcissistic church has got a brilliant, sort of algorithm to use, because
Mhm.
they not only control your here and now, but they control the hereafter, and so therefore, your life is of no consequence. And if the only reason it's valuable is for uh, the next life, when
Mhm.
you'll either be rewarded or punished. So I have to say, I was a very frightened little girl all the
Mhm.
time. I self-harmed, so I discovered self-harming quite early.
Mhm.
So I would be covered in sores all over my arms and legs and various other places. I
Would
didn't
that be from scratching
get
usually? Yeah.
scratching, and then I would infect it on purpose, so that
Mm.
it got really bad and inflamed, and I'd cover it up. So when you talk about it, it sounds ridiculous, but
Oh,
that
no.
happened. That is what happened.
Yeah.
Um, and food was a problem, because food was either a punishment or a reward. It was sinful to enjoy something. Anything that you enjoyed was sinful. So therefore, you should not enjoy something. Uh, it's a bizarre thing. If you ate too much, you were greedy. If you didn't eat enough, you were ungrateful. So as a child growing up, I wasn't sure what to do. And funny you say about martyrdom, because I honestly thought I would be asked to be a martyr, because
Mhm.
they even told me that there may come a time when I'd be asked to die for my faith. And I remember I was only a very small child thinking, I don't want to die for it. I'm going to let them down, because I won't be able to do it. Who was going to come
Sure.
for me? I don't know. It was a really strange, frightening thing. And this priest who lived there, and everybody had to be quiet and tiptoe around him. It was oppressive, and
It's
uh,
abuse. It's child
it was
abuse.
child abuse. I believe it is child abuse, and
Yes.
and
Yeah.
like this wretched thing about confession, where from the age of 6 you have to go every week to a man behind a grill and tell him all your sins. It's abusive. I mean, it's he's got that power. He knows who you are. It doesn't matter what they say. They know
Mhm.
exactly who you are. They know what child is vulnerable. They know what child isn't looked after very well, or maybe could be, left alone occasionally. They
Mhm.
they know which families are abusive. They know who's paying their taxes, who's having affairs.
Mhm.
They've got a real kind of understanding of the parish and the people in it. And it's a grooming room as well, because those
Mhm.
children who are vulnerable are in there behind this grill, and who knows what he's doing behind the grill. But it's definitely a grooming situation. So it was a crazy, crazy household, I have to
Mhm.
say.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's just you paint such a powerful and sad picture of what evangelicalism is regardless of the faith.
Yeah.
Can you, now you talked about the emotional and psychological abuse. Could you bear witness for others who might watch this about the physical abuse you endured,
Yes.
sexual abuse?
Yeah. Um, and it's important to have just talked about, as you say, that evangelical power abuse, because in the context of that, the sexual abuse is triple bad, because you already believe that this man is next to God and can do no wrong. So if he does do any wrong, it's got to be your fault. And
Mm-hmm.
the first time it happened, I was 10, and it was the night before my confirmation. I was sent away because we lived in a fairly isolated parish. I was sent to a sort of a summer school with a load of other children. And this priest, it wasn't the one that lived with us, but it was one that used to sometimes come and stay, because our priest was ill. And so he would be like a locum. And he came to this summer school. I had fallen off a seesaw, and I got a really damaged leg, and I hadn't told anybody about it, and it was going a very unpleasant green colour, and somebody noticed it, and I was sent for, and it was dressed, and one thing and another. I was ushered into this priest's office, and of course I was honoured, because they were just almost next to God, and I thought I was being singled out because I was special. And he lifted me on his knee in order to have a look at this leg, and then started to, use his fingers to manipulate me. And uh, I was like a rabbit in the headlight. I couldn't move. I
Mm-hmm.
froze. I didn't understand it. I mean, I was a very naive 10-year-old. I think
Mm-hmm.
I was 1957. I was a very naive 10-year-old. We were in those days. But
Mm-hmm.
I knew what he was doing was wrong, because
Mm-hmm.
you may know that as Catholics, we were never allowed to touch ourselves, and as kids, we had
Right.
to sleep with our arms across our chest to make
Mm-hmm.
sure we didn't touch our bodies. This obsession with the sins of the flesh was
Mm-hmm.
just constant. So I knew this was terribly wrong, but I believed it was my fault, because it couldn't be him, because he was next to God. So luckily, somebody came and disturbed him. I think it would have been a lot worse had he not been disturbed.
Mm-hmm.
And off he, off we went. And I had nightmares, because I thought, I started to have nightmares, and I believed it was my fault. I thought, I can't tell anybody about it, because if I tell somebody about it, I'll be in worse trouble. Something awful will happen to me because I've
Mm-hmm.
done this thing. So the following day, he behaved as if nothing had happened, and I thought, oh, it'll go away. And of course, it did go away for a while, because we weren't in that place. But because he came backwards and forwards to stay at our house, every opportunity that he could get me alone, he would grab me, he would corner me, he would slobber all over me. It was just really awful. But it wasn't as bad as it was when I got to be about 13, and my dad had just died, and I was very vulnerable,
And
and
this is now 3 years of on and off physical abuse.
on and off, on and
Yeah.
off, on and off, and not being able to tell anybody about it.
Right.
And my dad had a brain tumor, and so for a year he was very ill, and he died subsequently. And my mother sort of reverted to being a child herself. I mean, she just really couldn't cope with widowhood. So this man was in our house a lot more. And the
Mm.
last time that he abused me was I was nearly 13, not quite 13. And it was in our bedroom, in my bedroom.
Mm.
And I knew he drank, and he drank and drank and drank. And I knew that he was shaping up for something.
Mm-hmm.
So I tried to go to bed and get out of the way. And I thought he'd leave me alone, but of course he didn't. He came up into the bedroom,
What a
and
predator.
he was, and started to really attack me. And on this time, he actually managed to rape me. It wasn't, didn't, uh, I just didn't know what was happening. He tore my nightie. Um, I, I can remember scraping the wallpaper off the wall with my hands. So I can't bear the smell of wallpaper. It's a
Mm.
real trigger for me. And he smelt of stale whiskey and
Mm.
sweat, and he was a disgusting human being, and I was so frightened. And I also remember smiling at him because I thought if I made friends with him, I don't know what I thought, but I was considering that if I was nice to him, he would leave me alone. And of course, he didn't. He just
But you're so vulnerable. You're a
I was,
child. You know,
I
you're a
was,
victim.
I was like a wildebeest, really, being singled off. And but the worst part was that I heard the door downstairs go, and my mother came upstairs and she caught him. Luckily, he was just jumping up and dressing himself. I
Hmm.
was starting to wheeze because I'm asthmatic and I've got
Hmm.
ornitis. She realised what had happened and she did nothing about it.
Mm.
She just she just ascertained. I didn't even understand the questions. I was so naive, but she ascertained if there was any chance I could be pregnant, and then she gave me a clean nightdress, but she didn't change my bed, and
Mm.
and I lay in that all night wondering what the hell was going to happen to me. And in the morning, everybody was waiting on him again. Yes, Father. No, Father. 3 bags full, Father. Would you like another cup of
Oh my
coffee,
God.
Father? And I felt totally sacrificial. I felt like I was of no consequence at all. I already felt lower than a snake's belly in the grass, and this was kind of reinforced that feeling that I was of no consequence. So that's really how a downward spiral really continued. And she did nothing about it. She would never talk to me about it again. So I had nobody I could go to. There was nobody I could talk to about it.
Hmm.
I became defensive. I started to bunk off school. The self-harming got ridiculous.
Hmm.
I used to do some crazy things like, do you remember? I don't know whether you had them, but they were like round balls of horrible liquid soap that they had at school, and you tipped them up. And I tipped it into my eyes.
Oh my.
Why? I had no idea. And
Right.
I,
But you're suffering. You were
oh,
suffering, and you can't even at this age. You know, the human brain doesn't even fully form until you're 21.
that's
So
right.
so
Yeah,
you know so
still valuable.
you're still, yeah, you're suffering, and
It was
you're
horrible.
finding that there's no relief, no one to talk to. There's no agency, no person.
And I felt it was my fault. That was the other thing. I
Right.
felt total guilt. People laugh about it, Catholic guilt. It's a fairly, sort of hot topic, and people say, oh, Catholics full of guilt. And it is something that people laugh about. But I think if you grow up with it, it's not funny because
Hmm.
everything but breathing is sinful. And so you're full of guilt and shame and embarrassment all the
Hmm.
time.
Hmm.
I started to drink when I was about. I started to drink when I was about 12. Whenever I could get hold of it, because of course I couldn't go and get it, but it was there,
Right.
and so I would use it whenever I got the chance. I smoked. I mean, really smoked. I would take anything that would alter my mood. So anything that got handed around, I wanted some of it. I thought booze had been made for me. I thought it was designed for me because it made me feel better.
Hmm.
And so I sought it out every possible occasion.
Hmm.
And there weren't that many occasions. I would babysit for people, and of course they would have, bottles,
Liquor.
and I would drink that, and any chance I got, I would drink. It was I had blackouts. By the time I was 15, I was having blackouts. I didn't know where I'd been or who I'd been with. It was a downward spiral of misery, really.
And you were married previously to a man who abused you as well, correct?
Yeah. Well, I ran away from home, and I decided that getting married was the answer. I felt alienated. I think the worst thing about being an abuse victim is alienation.
Hmm.
Um, I didn't belong in a pack anymore. I didn't belong in a team, in a tribe. I didn't belong. And as you know, that's a human imperative to be part of a whole. And I
Sure,
did not
sure.
belong in anywhere. And I was permanently looking for somewhere to belong. I joined all sorts of organizations over the years, but you can't belong where you don't belong. But It was a real determined effort. There was part of me desperately wanted something wholesome, but another part of me knew that I would drink or I would use chemicals, and
You didn't feel worthy.
no, I didn't. I wasn't worthy, and I ran away. And I was 17 when I got married to somebody very, very immature, the same as me. So it was a disaster waiting to happen. We were both, we were children playing at being grown up, and I was already a drinking alcoholic, so I was not a good person to be with. And he became very aggressive and very violent. And I was married to him until I was 30, nearly 30. So, it was a downward spiral all the time, a downward spiral. No self-worth, no anything really. And this man would beat me up, and I thought I deserved it. I would allow him to beat me up because I really thought that that's what I deserved. So it was out of the frying pan into the fire, really. But the only thing that kind of saved me was the fact that during that time, although I was a mess a lot of the time, I managed to acquire 6 children. And of all the things I've ever done, they're my greatest achievement, and they saved my life because I didn't want for them the sort of life that I had. And so I was 29 when I realized that if I didn't do something about my situation now, this moment, then there would be a tragedy in my home, and it would probably involve my children. And it was more than I could bear, really. So although I didn't consider myself a good mother, I didn't know much about parenting, but I loved them dearly, and I didn't want that life for them. And so age 29, I put down the bottle that I was drinking and picked up the phone and asked somebody for help.
Wow.
Now,
So that was your trigger.
That was my trigger.
And it was there for probably a very long time, but you needed to get to...
You have to get to where you need to be.
Yeah.
And the people, it wasn't a rock bottom, because worse things had happened to me before that, far worse. I got away skin of my teeth with all sorts of things. So it wasn't that sort of crisis, but there was a sense, there was a realization, a moment of clarity where I can honestly envisage where it was going and how it might end. And it was more than I could bear, really. So it was the trigger to pick up the phone and ask for help. Now, my initial place to go to was AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. And it saved my life, there's no doubt. It absolutely, the person that answered the phone that night saved my life because I stopped drinking. And
did you stop cold turkey?
Absolutely, stopped cold turkey, started going to meetings. I didn't feel very well, but I stopped cold turkey. And I started to meet people that I'd never come across before. I'd never met that level of honesty and humility and compassion. There was lots I don't like about AA, because it's very hard to be an atheist in AA.
Right.
But if you can see through that and just to the heart of the people, you can deal with it. So I think with all things, you take out of it that which is valuable, and you leave behind that which is not. So although there are lots of things I don't kind of agree with in terms of the 12-step movement, it saved my life. It was where I started, and I have got eternal gratitude for the people that helped me. I don't believe it was a higher power. I don't believe it was anything like that. I think it was the power of human beings. It was other human beings with compassion and honesty and humility and real support. Inevitably, my marriage didn't last very long after that, because I was no longer easy to manipulate, and I wouldn't allow myself to be beaten, and I wanted money for food and things like that. So that didn't last terribly long after that. But my ex-husband walked out, and he left me with 6 kids under 12.
Wow.
So my oldest was 12 and Daniel, my youngest, was 3 months old when he left. And I had no support at all. I've got no, because obviously my extended family were not, my mother, she was still alive, and her sisters, but unless I got on my knees and offered it up, I wouldn't be helped
Right.
there. So I was on my own with it really. And I suddenly realized that I just got to get some armor around us, and it was like me and the kids against the world really. And
Mhm.
gradually, I got rehoused into another house. I got a job, just a part-time job, when Daniel was at nursery school. Then I got another job. Then I went back to college. Then I went back, as soon as he went to school, I went back to college and I got a degree, and um, I did a counselling diploma.
Mhm.
I'd always felt happier with disenfranchised people like me. I still do to a large
Mhm.
extent, which is why I feel very comfortable in prison. So it was inevitable, really, that I went into counselling. So I became a counsellor at the Alcohol Advisory Service in a city near us. Kids were doing well at school. My ex-husband paid nothing in terms of maintenance, so I had to
Mhm.
support them myself. So it's hard work, real hard work. But the older ones helped look after the younger ones, and they were doing incredibly well. So I was settled, and I got a better house. I learned to drive. I got a car, and people helped. People in
Right.
AA had taught me to drive, and
Mhm.
uh, babysat when I was doing things like that. So it was hard work, but it was working. Um,
So you're certainly a role model for your children, and I think children of the world, to be perfectly honest with you. Can you talk about how you started Survivor's Voice Europe?
yeah. It's sort of once again, it's a sort of an evolving thing. I had never talked publicly about the abuse, never. um, I had, I think I should have said, and it was quite important. um, I started when I was working and I was counselling. Everything was going really well, and I met my second husband, Jez, as you know. And
Who is probably one of the kindest,
yeah,
gentlest, funniest human beings on the
wonderful.
planet.
Yes, I got the lottery there.
Yeah.
But you can imagine what my mother would say about that. She was horrified that I would think of getting married again. And so she was really furious about it. And just after Jess and I got together, my son Nick was killed in a car crash,
Yes.
and he was 19. And
Mhm.
it just broke me completely. I didn't want to drink. I didn't want to use chemicals, but I didn't want to live either. So
Mhm.
Jess had such a lot to cope with when we first got together,
Mhm.
because me and the kids had been such a unit,
Mhm.
um, and it was horrible, really. And it was very difficult to go back into counselling,
Mhm.
um, because I worked in the very heavy end of addiction,
Mhm.
not in the area where somebody had an occasional glass of sherry too much, but where they were dropping dead. So it was difficult
Right.
to go
Real
back.
hardcore people who
Real
are,
hardcore,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
We'd always been interested in food, and Jez is a superb cook, as I know that you know that. And the kids were all wanting to help. So we did a crazy thing, and we stopped everything we were doing, and we opened a vegetarian restaurant in our town. And for a couple of years, we worked at that, and it was a real healing experience. It was something that we were making rather than tearing down. At the acupuncture college, there's a college of Chinese medicine in that town, and quite a lot of the students, actually a lot of American students, came in because we were cooking very good food, and it was all very organic, and the usual healthy stuff. And I got fascinated with Chinese medicine, and I still am. Not the hocus pocus variety of
Mhm.
Chinese medicine, but the poetic theories, the kind of way of looking at the universe is really quite beautiful and very real.
Mhm.
Most of what we've learned in Western medicine has been in post-mortem. We've kind of
Mhm.
learned a lot of what we know by post-mortem. And the ancient Chinese didn't do that. They observed people in
Mhm.
health, out of health, what changed, how would their color change, what did their demeanor change. They got very good at it because they didn't have many other tools, and they passed that down. So all of that really fascinated me. Anyway, long story, I went and then did a degree in Chinese medicine, and I became a practitioner. But you know what? Addiction is in my blood. I thought I'd maybe just be in general practice and help people with bad backs and things like that. But gradually, people that I used to know when I was counselling used to come in our restaurant and bring all their problems with them. And it's in my DNA, really. And so there was an inevitability about it. Started to work at the local hospital, detox unit, to help with their sort of detoxification. In England, it's very different. As you know, our health service is free. So we don't, I mean, it's not totally free because those of us that work pay taxes, and but it's free at the point of delivery to everybody. Anybody and everybody gets free treatment. So in every town in England, there are free drug and alcohol services. There are free, everything's free. So I worked in the hospital where people would go in and be detoxed. It is, I know you asked me particularly about the advocacy, but I think it's the context. So I'd never talked about abuse, never talked about it in public at all. I started to work in addiction. I developed a program, I developed a particular protocol that's been very, very useful as an adjunctive treatment within detoxification, within mental health services. And I worked on it. I came over to the States, I came over to New York and into the Bronx to see what they were doing there. There was some stuff going on in the Lincoln Memorial Hospital. It had been pioneered by the Black Panthers and the Young Lords many years ago, and a fascinating start because it was community led. It was about people for people. So I came over and had a look at it and then brought it back here, and then we kind of ran with it. I've got a colleague who's a doctor of neuroscience, a PhD neuroscientist, Kim Wager, fascinates me with the brain every day, and we kind of got this program together. In 2010, I was given this award, Lifetime Achievement Award. Can you imagine? That's the sort of, that's what they give you when you're just about to drop dead, I think.
Well, you showed them.
But the point was, this feeling of unworthiness and of no consequence has always been there, still there. As I was going up to get this award, I felt completely and utterly false. I felt a fraud. I felt completely unworthy, and it was the most bizarre feeling. And I always feel like that anyway, but this was highlighted, and I had to make a speech of acceptance and thanks and all that. And it was coincided in 2010 with the Pope's visit coming. So there's lots of talk about it, lots of talk about this happening. I had managed to walk away from the church. Thankfully, I got out of it. It's very difficult to do that when you have been indoctrinated like that, because it goes in deep and it goes in young and it stays a long time. And that feeling, although there was no belief at all, there was that sword of Damocles hanging over me all the time. So I got this award, and as I was going up, feeling lower than a snake's belly in the grass, being given this foot, it occurred to me that everybody was talking about this stuff and I was silent. I was sort of hiding behind everybody else that was talking about it and coming out and being counted. So I chose that moment in that speech to say that I was a recovered addict, but I was also a recovered Catholic, and just briefly what that was about. And there was a bit of a stunned silence, but I felt better having at least unleashed it. After that, there was a magazine article came out, and people were talking about this thing that I'd done and this award that I'd got. So it's just a magazine article. But then the television company, the mainstream television company in England, got hold of me and asked if I would go on to do a film with Peter Tatchell, wonderful human rights advocate Peter Tatchell here, a very famous and very admirable man. And I was honoured, but a little scared. But long story, it was going to be filmed to coincide with the Pope's visit. And it was called The Trouble of the Pope. And so I had decided that I would do that and then walk away from this particular, fight. Because it's quite difficult talking about it all the time. You do get So I thought, well, I'll do that. I feel like I ought to do it. It's right to do it. Somebody else might benefit. So I did this film. And of course, these films, they open up a whole can of worms. And it went out the week that the Pope came. And I was phoned up and asked if I would consider making a speech at the march. That we're going to have a march, a protest march against the Pope's visit. Well, I felt very strongly about him not coming. And so I thought, yeah, I'll do that. And then I'll walk away from it. Because this is not for me. I thought it would be a minor thing. I went down to London and there were 20,000 people marched that day, all humanists, secularists, atheists. This makes me cry, so I apologize.
No.
I can talk about all the other stuff, but this stuff is emotional. So I remember thinking, I can't do this. There's no way I can talk to all these people. There's so many. I didn't realize it would be like this. And there's a wonderful man, a humanist in London called Marco Tranchino. He's an Italian. And he had to hold me up. I was so scared. But I made it. And I looked out onto this sea of faces, all of these humanist secularists. Honestly, it was the first time I thought I belonged to the human race. The first time ever, I really felt I belonged, because these warm faces were actually looking straight at me and supporting me. And we marched, and they dedicated the march to all the survivors of clergy abuse. So it was a very emotional day. And I thought, that's it. That's great. I've done my, I'm going to walk away from this now because this is too much for me.
Every time you think you're done, it's sort of
opened up again. So I went home and I didn't think about it for a while. There was a lot of food for thought. There were lots of press conferences and interviews and television interviews, and all over the world, 14 different countries sent TV cameras because the Pope was here. It made me think, and I met a lot of other survivors who had also been dragged into this thing. And I said to a psychologist friend of mine who I worked with in the prison, actually, and I said, I don't know about going down there to this. I don't know whether I'm going to like it. And she said, you'll meet people. You'll meet other people. And it would be like when you first met other addicts. You'll just relate to them and you'll feel really supported with each other. And, I hated it. I hated it so much. And the reason was that the people that were invited were the ones that have got the organizations, because there's a sort of cottage industry has been grown up out of these tragedies. People immediately want to start organizations and they're asking for money right, left and center, and welcome to our website, donate here. It was a real kind of eye-opener, and I felt very uncomfortable. The other thing, of course, is quite a few of them are still very much attached to the church. And so there was a lot of talk of God and stuff like that, which I find very, very difficult to be around. And so it wasn't for me, and I wished them well and I walked away. And then I said to Jez, that's it, finished now. And then I got a very small email from two Americans in Boston, Gary Bergeron, who I think you've met actually, and Bernie McDade. And they just sent me a simple email, and it just said, we're a couple of survivors from Boston. I mean, we didn't know at the time that all that Boston stuff had come out in the way that it did. We're going to meet in Rome in October. Do you fancy coming? That was all they said. They didn't say we're going to organize this. It was like, we're going to meet in Rome. We'd like to, do you feel like coming? And I just said to Jez, I feel like I want to go and dump it right where it came from. It just felt like it was a final act, take this stuff and shove it back in the Vatican. So Jez said, well, I'll come with you. And of course, as you know, he's a painter and he paints. And so it was an opportunity for him to look at Rome and see what he could paint. And it was there that I met Gary and Bernie. That was the most incredible thing, because we didn't need to talk. It was a sort of shared agony that, you kind of knew. You didn't need to say anything. And so it was there that I realized there were people that were feeling the same way as me, that wanted something better for other survivors. And so we danced in front of the Vatican. We didn't go to protest. We went to celebrate. and celebrate away from them, and they weren't invited. And this awful man, Federico Lombardi, is the papal spokesman, came out of the Vatican and wanted to make a speech, and Gary wouldn't let him and told him to go back where he came from. This was not about him, it was about us.
Good.
But we were ushered into the Vatican and met this man who was totally disconnected from everything and anything that we were saying. There were several people, some from the States, 14 different countries again, were represented there.
As survivors of survivors of
priesthood. All survivors. And it was there that I met my dear friends from the Anthony Provolo Institute in Verona in Italy. They're all deaf and speech impaired, and they were all abused in their childhood by the priests that were supposed to be looking after them. One man by 16 priests, deaf and dumb children. They call them, we don't say dumb, we say speech impaired, but they say deaf and dumb.
The perfect victim.
Yeah, exactly. They couldn't speak.
They can't talk. They couldn't defend themselves. Right?
They couldn't tell anybody. Nobody heard them scream. It's horrendous. And since then, we've become firm friends, and we marched with them and they marched with us, and we had such a joyful occasion. And it was there that I met Ton, my colleague from Holland. And he and I decided that we would create something that was not a money-making project, that would not fundraise, that we would do it out of our own pockets, and we would do it out of compassion. And that's what we would do. We would share skills and share knowledge and help individual survivors as much as we could. And so that's how Survivor's Voice came about. And we've been fiercely protective of that original idea, that we were not money making, we were not fundraisers, we are simply survivors who want to pass on any information and knowledge that we have. And we've supported people from all over the world. It's just been remarkable.
My question, how many people have sought out Survivor's Voice Europe? Do you know?
No, not really. It's difficult to know, because one of the things that we have done is we've created a website with stuff that they can interact with. So they can get a lot of self-help stuff on there. And we point them in the direction of various therapies or various lawyers. So we become more of a signposting organization. If they want to get in touch with us individually, we'll support them individually, of course, and we do. But we don't keep records, because it's completely non-profit. It's completely outside of all of those things. So we don't keep records. We're just there for anybody who needs us.
And for people's privacy as well, you know.
Yeah, absolutely important that people aren't, they feel they've got a space where they can be safe. Since that visit to Rome, I've been back to Rome 4 times to do various things. I spoke in the Italian Parliament, and I support them. Every year, the Verona people have a march through Verona. It's very difficult for them in Italy because it's very Catholic oriented.
Sure.
Very hard for these. They're elderly now. They're as old as me, and some of them aren't well, and some of them have got wheelchairs, and some of them are on crutches. And the church rely upon this generation of survivors to drop dead. We'll be dead soon. So unless we keep going, the next generation of survivors, and there will be a new generation of survivors, we'll have to start again. So we've got to keep this going, and we've got to record it, and we've got to make sure that people know. Otherwise, the next generation of survivors will have to start from scratch, because the church will never, ever change. It won't.
Right.
It's a narcissistic organization. It ticks all the boxes for narcissism, and every therapist knows that the thing you do with a narcissist is walk away from them. So the more you feed them, the more you go and beg for them to change or for them to look after survivors, the greater their narcissism is. So we don't bother with them at all. If we go there, it's it's because Rome's beautiful, and we can celebrate there in front of the Vatican, but we don't bother trying to advocate or trying to change the church, because it's a waste of energy. We're not going to do that.
So one of the things I so admire about you, Sue, is that you really do bear witness for so much of um, human pain and suffering, being a victim and being a survivor and being a thriver. You know, you've learned to thrive after all of this stuff has been thrown at you from literally from your own family to your community to the world, and you sought in yourself to begin the healing process, for the sake of not so much for certainly for yourself, but for your children, which is a very external way to
Yeah.
begin the process. Can you talk a little bit about how you made the transition from advocate from clergy sex abuse to how you work with those who are incarcerated?
Yes. I've been teaching 25 years this particular protocol for, it's an adjunctive treatment in substance misuse. We teach it from a scientific basis. So we talk a lot about, we use ear points, and we talk about vagal nerve stimulation, and we've done some research. We did some research in the prison. So we've been doing that for 25 years, really. And I'm probably a little biased, but I would suggest that we've got the best prison system in the world, because they do try very hard in there to be a force for change.
Mhm.
There is an atmosphere of trying to make sure that people do have the opportunity to transform things. So they do get a lot of help with that. It's not a softly place. It's still maximum security and very disciplined.
Mhm.
But I feel very comfortable with incarcerated people. I think an awful lot of them were abused as children. A lot of them are addicts. A lot of them have got PTSD. There's a whole raft of things going on. My interventions really are not about getting people out. It's not about crime reduction. It's about dealing with the human beings. Some of them are never going to come out. They're always going to be in there. But
Mhm.
you want them to have a quality of life. You don't want them to be killing each other. So
Mhm.
just because they're going to be incarcerated forever doesn't mean that you shouldn't try and make a difference to their lives and to those around. When you're in prison, it's a community, whether you like it or not, you're in a community.
Mhm.
So it evolved once again. It evolved, and it grew and grew and grew, and so that we've got about 130 prisons in England, and I have taught in 128 of them.
Yeah.
So all the maximum security prisons, all the dangerous severe personality disorder units we've got. So really, it was like going in there and identifying where I could be valuable, if I could be valuable, and in what capacity I could be valuable. And so they ask me to go in. I don't advertise; it's word of mouth. They buy me in to go and put in this program. But I'm very excited because, and I love it. I absolutely love it. I like being with the people. I like being with the staff. They're very committed humanitarians. It is not quite as punitive um, approach here as it perhaps is in other countries.
Oh, in the US, it is quite literally a prison industrial complex. It is a business.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
um,
Money's involved again.
yeah, and it's not. I'm sure there are people, of course, who are advocates for people who are incarcerated,
Of
and
course.
but the system is not set up to bring about any level of humanity.
No, it isn't. I
In
don't know this
the
to be
US.
fair. I've been and visited a couple, and I had a lovely intern came to stay with. Well, no, April. You remember April?
Oh yes, very much. Yes,
She
yes,
came and stayed with me because
yes.
she was working at Rikers Island at the time, and she wanted to come and see what the prisons were like in England. So
Hmm.
she came and stayed with us for about 2 or 3 weeks, and I took her around a few of the places that I work. I took her into a Category A Mexican security prison where it houses probably the most damaged people in our society. And they're all psychopaths. They've all got at least 2 personality disorders, and they're all doing life. So she, I don't know what she expected, but she said her chin was on her chest because she couldn't understand how it was that it was such a pleasant place to be. And, that they would talk about it, and they have programs, and they've got educational programs, even though they're not coming out, because they're not going to be able to come out, but they're learning, and they're learning about their condition. I went maybe 2 years ago now and spent 2 days with those prisoners, just talking to them about adverse childhood experiences and their brain and how things work like that. And it didn't mean that they were going to come out, and it wasn't, but it gave them an understanding about why they felt the way they felt. And nobody wins if you don't try and make a change when you're in that situation. There is no win situation. You've got to be able to make changes. And I'm so touched because they sent me a card. I wasn't well a while ago, as you may know. And I got this great big card that's signed by about 27 psychopaths. And they had to get permission to send it to me. And the governor had to ask my permission to send it as well, because it's an unusual thing. But it's a prized possession. I mean, how brilliant is that? So what I've found in the work that I do is not just the prison, but it's been about breaking down barriers, getting hardened, tough prison officers to do a simple treatment on a very damaged prisoner was a joy to watch, because they took away their uniform and showed that they were human. And their barriers broken down at that moment. They've still got a job to do, and they're still going to be in that situation, but the situation is different.
And you think about how this advocacy could have helped people who are incarcerated if they had received it 20 years ago.
Exactly. Absolutely. And I feel the same in a way, because it's no use crying over spilt milk. And but there's no doubt that all of my teens and 20s and a lot of my 30s were lost. And this business about sexual abuse, often people think it's just a fumble behind the bike sheds, or something that you've got out of proportion. But we know from research that people who've been abused at that age have probably 20 years less life expectancy than the rest of the population. They get damage to their brain, to their immune system, to other metabolic systems. So it actually puts a child on a totally different trajectory, physically as well as emotionally. And a lot of our prisons are filled with those people. They are. And so it's been a pleasure and a joy. And more recently, one of the prisons asked me if I would teach prisoners to do acupuncture treatment on other prisoners. And I didn't think it was a very good idea, to be honest. I thought maybe, we would never get insurance for it to start with, and it just didn't feel appropriate. But it occurred to me that there was no reason why they shouldn't learn theories. There was no reason why they shouldn't understand why things were being done to them. So I went up to one of our prisons for a couple of days and did just that. And the idea is to show them, not to show them because that sounds condescending, but to explore with them the fact that they're made of the same atoms, the same stardust as everybody. So we start off by saying, you're made of the same stardust as the governor, the same stardust as the Pope, the same stardust as the Queen. I mean, and these hardened criminals have never heard that sort of approach before. So they really took to it, and they really got involved with it and got engaged in it. And anyway, that evolved even further. So I created a program. It's called a 5-star well-being program, on the principle that everybody should have the best. And we've created these coaches within the prison, and they learn a lot of stuff, and they get a lot of skills that they can use for themselves. But more than anything, they can pass on to their peers, to each other. So they become the go-to person, because it's quite difficult, very difficult when you think that somebody in prison could have a bereavement or and they can't go anywhere. They can't go and see their mother if their father's died. If their child is run over by a bus, they can't just go and to the hospital.
Right,
They're
right.
kind of stuck. And sometimes the staff situation is such that there aren't enough staff members to deal with things. So these coaches are stepping into the breach. But what's happened is that it's given them some self-esteem. Because I remember, and I often quote you, really. I don't know whether you remember, but when I was in New York with you, and we were talking about getting up and giving somebody a seat in the subway,
Mm-hmm.
and that's not something you normally do, but when you did do it, the person smiled and you smiled, but more than anything, everybody else around them smiled as well.
About human connection, absolutely.
Absolutely. So I teach them about that and say, look, we go right back to the Big Bang. We go right back to the atoms, and then we start from scratch and start to learn about this. I do use some of the Chinese theories because it's lovely for them, because they know a lot about that stuff, because a lot of the things that they're doing, they're relying on their senses a lot of the time. They're relying on, they can tell you who's walking down the corridor by the way the keys in their pocket is swinging. They know what they're having for dinner next week because the changes in smells. They're very tuned in to senses. So it's been easier for me to kind of really hone those senses with them, so that they call them smelly balls, but we've got these. I created these aroma dough things, which are like a putty, a stress putty, and we put essential oils in, so lavender and frankincense, and they smell beautiful. And also the brain will respond to two senses being used together. So I've always made these things, but I can't take them in prison because they can't have this putty, because they could easily make a mold out of it or block a keyhole up. So it's not allowed. So it bothered me. So what I did was I got some of those magicians' foam balls that magicians use from a magician warehouse, and we've infused them with essential oils, and then we seal them, and I'm able to take those in.
Bravo.
So they can smell lavender and they can smell chamomile in those cells. And it's just about humanity. It's about showing humanity to them and allowing them to then show their humanity, of which they've got a lot. So they then go and take that to other people within the prison. And I've been so humbled by it, and I've learned so much from them. That it's been so exciting, because I think, talking about walking away, I'm 74 almost, and sometimes I think I should be perhaps just knitting and making.
I don't see you ever doing that.
Well, something happens.
I mean, it's lovely to do, certainly. Yeah.
But something happens and you think, oh, that's so exciting. I have got nuns doing Chinese medicine out of vans in the middle of a city centre for sex workers in the middle of the night. There's a lot of barriers broken down.
Wonderful.
So I've been so fortunate,
Well, we've been fortunate to have you here. I mean, really. Could you, now you have a new book out. So it's the Hidden Superpower of Addiction.
That's right.
And it's available on Amazon and wherever wonderful books are sold. I certainly recommend it highly to my audience, because it's profound and lovely and such a humane book. Could you talk a little bit about it and how you see brain science and addiction working?
Yeah. Yes, because that's what prompted me to write it. I got completely frustrated, or I get completely frustrated with the constant negative narrative that surrounds addicts. You've only got to hear the word addict and everybody immediately has an image in their head. And mostly it's incorrect. Yes, there's criminal behavior, and yes, there's things that need to be fixed. But actually, addicts are incredibly specialized human beings. They've got a lot of skills. And we talk a lot about, we can focus specifically on the brain because, of course, the brain is the target organ of addiction. Livers don't get addicted, neither do kidneys, but it's brains that get addicted. And so the idea is that addicts aren't broken, they're not damaged, they're not sick, they're just born in the wrong century. A few 100 years ago, it would be people like that, people like me, who'd be valued within our communities, largely because we're not happy with anything unless it's the very best. We want bigger, better, more. And it stems from a time when food and water were scarce. And as you know, we need diversity in our population in the world. And so that's why some of us can't lose weight, because we would have survived a famine a long time ago. But there are some people who are hardwired towards low reward activity. So there's a low reward allele, which means that they can experience pleasure and reward, but only with a stronger stimulus. So they can feel the same pleasure as everybody else, but not without a stronger stimulus. They need a stronger stimulus in order to do it. And over the years, I've taught many healthcare workers, and I've always heard the same thing. If only we could channel that manipulative quality of the addict, if only they could channel it into something positive, if only we could bottle that stuff. And so Kim and I have always delved into everything, right, as much as we possibly can. And so we realized that it was people like that with this low reward activity that would have been valued, because they would have been the ones going out for the fattest boar and the wildest animal, and would have gone for days on end looking for the best, the biggest, the most, and would not be happy with the apple tree in the garden. In this day and age, although, you know, the universe doesn't need that kind of wiring or that kind of seeking, some of us have still got that wiring, that residual drive for the biggest, best, most. And if you ask any addict, what they felt like, even long before they found their drug of choice, they will always tell you that they were told they were ungrateful, or they felt a sense of ennui, a sense of dissatisfaction or disillusionment, underwhelmed. And they always wondered why they felt like that. And it wasn't until, you know, they hit something with a bigger stimulus that they got the level of pleasure. As human beings, we're all seekers of pleasure. I mean, that's what we do. I mean, that's what food's about. That's what sex about, and exercise and everything.
Oh, that's what having, you know, this works great within the context of capitalism, because addiction, the drug can be the bigger TV.
Absolutely.
You know, it could be the shiniest car, you know.
Absolutely. It can be whatever it is, anything that works in the reward pathway in a very profound way. And if you have got that predisposition towards bigger, better, more, and you're not getting the satisfaction without a stronger stimulus, then you're inevitably going to seek out stronger stimulus. And if you consider that actually sex is the biggest pleasure hit that we can get, I mean, most human beings get the biggest pleasure hit from intercourse. Crack cocaine is 1,000 times more potent than sex. 1,000 times more pleasurable. Now, that's a hell of a pleasure hit to walk away from. And the other thing that happens, of course, is that tolerance occurs, because once you've experienced something that's as big a reward as that, you are thereafter forever chasing that big hit. Never going to get there. Never going to get there, because the brain has turned down the sensitivity to that, and so you need more to get the same hit. So but I wouldn't say belief. My knowledge now is that addicts aren't broken. They're simply wired in a different way, in the same way that an autistic person is wired in a different way. It doesn't mean that they're broken. It means that they're wired in a different way, and we have specific skills. Doesn't mean that they can learn to use again, because they can't. Because once you've crossed over that line and sort of in the brain long-term potentiation has occurred, there is no going back. There isn't. But my goodness, you can bypass those neural pathways, and you can create new ones. And natural ones so that they become favored. So, it's really describing in very simple terms how the brain works,
Mhm.
and what happens and why you use these mind-altering chemicals, and why there are some people with a predisposition towards addiction, but that does not mean that it's an inevitability, and it certainly doesn't mean that they're broken or sick. It
Mhm.
just means that they're specialized. And I
Mhm.
tell all of my patients that they've got specialized wiring. But it's like anything else, you've got to be careful of things. So I always say, it's like being a superhero. You can, Superman can do so many things, but he's got to keep away from kryptonite.
Right.
And, and Achilles had got his heel. So you,
Right.
as long as you keep away from that which will kill you, you can fly.
Right.
And seeing
Wow.
people soar, I think, is where it's about empowerment. Going back to AA, and I love the people, I love them dearly.
Mhm.
But some of the stuff, like, the whole thing starts with I am powerless.
Mhm.
And I am not powerless at all. I am not powerless. I have to stay away from that which would kill me. But given that I'm doing that, I can be a lot more empowered. And that's really important to me to show people how they can be empowered themselves.
Sue, this is such a humane message, and I hope that everyone who eventually sees our episode today, if they can just process 5% of what you've given so generously of your time and your attention, I think you will, again, it's like dropping a pebble in the water, as you say, and how those rings go out. We certainly don't know how many people this series that we're doing touches, but it almost makes no difference, because if it touches one person and it
Yeah,
makes a difference in one person's life,
yeah.
then we've increased the level, we've dialed up the humanity and dialed down the violence that we give to each other.
That's exactly how I feel. And when I first worked in addiction, I was told that every addict affected or made ill at least 4 people around them. And actually, we all thought at the time that's a very conservative estimate. It's more likely to be at least 1 naught and maybe 2. But when you
Mhm.
consider the family and the extended family and the community and society as a whole, but I think you can say the same about recovery, and you can say the same about transformation. If
Mhm.
one person gets better, then everybody benefits.
Everyone around,
And that's
exactly.
why the prison is so important, because they're an untapped source of humanity that actually want the opportunity. Not all of them. I mean, some of them are very damaged, and maybe that, but the people that I deal with, I'm so proud of them. Some of them are doing life for
Mhm.
very serious crimes. But to see them care for a less fortunate person is
Mhm.
so humbling. And
Mhm.
to allow them to do that, because,
Mhm.
as therapists or whatever we consider ourselves to be, we tend to keep that for ourselves, don't we? All of that feeling, what do we call it? A helpless high.
Mhm.
When you help somebody, you get more feel good chemicals. So we keep
Sure.
it all to ourselves. We,
Right.
we tell all these patients what they can get and how they can, get this and get that. But we forget to tell them what they can give, and they're going to get so much more benefit from that.
Mhm.
And they just blossom, I just see them blossom. And now, going in there is just like going home, really. And it just feels like a safe place to be,
Mhm.
even though, not everybody sees it that way. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Sue. You've
And
been wonderful, and we've been speaking for more than an hour, and I've been enthralled every second of our conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we end, or I think you've covered everything, and I think you're just such a delight.
you are so sweet. You make me feel a delight because you're so sweet. No, it's been a pleasure. I'm afraid I can talk for England when it comes to work. I do tend to not be able to shut up. So
No,
thank
no,
you for allowing me to
and that is for our benefit, trust me.
well, I hope it is, because it's wonderful to see you and to meet Carl, of course, and to see the family, and hoping we'll get together properly soon, because it's been too long.
It's way too long. And thank you for everything that you've done. You don't need my thanks, but you should know that you have made a world of change in my life and in the lives of thousands of others, millions of others.
Oh, that's very humbling.
Thank you.
Much love to you.
Thank you.
See you soon.